Today's lecture will be over Chapter 4, Section 1, Objectives. Number 1, define culture and explain its impact. Number 2, explain how culture changes and spreads. Number 3, describe how language unites and divides people and how it changes and spreads. Number 4, identify and define 3 categories of religion. And number 5, describe the world's major religions. And finally, number 6, identify modes of cultural expression. So what we're going to look at today is we're going to look at culture, and culture is actually something in geography that we talk a lot about. We'll look at different cultures around the world, from South America to Europe to African culture, all the way into Southwest Asia's cultures. So what we're going to see is that the definition of culture is knowledge, attitudes, behaviors shared over a generation. And what this means is that this culture is something that's going to be shared from parents to their kids, and then the kids are going to go ahead and share that culture to their kids as well. Now, one thing to make sure that we understand is that culture can definitely change. For example, you might have different views than your parents. You might have different ideas than your parents. That's where the culture is consistently changing. It can change for the good. It can also change for bad. What we see as a society then is a group of people that share geographic regions, identities, and cultures. So, for example, in Nebraska, we might have a society. We share a region. We also identify with each other, and we also have the same type of culture. In Nebraska, especially when we start talking about things like politics, we have a different culture than that of New York, specifically New York City, and that of some California areas. So a society is that group of people that share that culture. A little bit different than an ethnic group. An ethnic group shares language, customs, and common heritage. Now, one thing to understand is that this ethnic group, just because you speak the same language doesn't mean that you're part of the same ethnic group. For example, there are many people throughout Central and South America that speak Spanish. They're not considered to be part of their ethnic group just because they share the same language. But when you start adding in different customs and different heritages, that's where you start seeing ethnic groups starting to emerge. So those three terms, very important, very different. Now, we also see an innovation, and this is basically how culture is kind of goes throughout the entire world. Innovation is created when something new is kind of created from existing resources. So, for example, and I'm going to use a different example than the book does, but if you cut down trees, those trees there could just be something for firewood and things like that. But an innovation would be if somebody came along and said, hey, wood floats, we're going to go ahead and hollow out the wood and build a canoe. That would be an innovation. That's creating something new with existing resources. Now, diffusion is basically the spreading of culture. So diffusion is the spread of ideas, inventions, and patterns of behavior. So what we see is that, for example, if you start looking at New York City is a cultural hearth, or a site of innovations and the origin of cultural diffusion. So you might see in New York City, for example, people wearing certain types of clothing. That clothing then diffuses throughout the entire United States. It started in New York City, and that is the cultural hearth, but it diffuses, or we have diffusion, that it goes and it basically spreads throughout the entire country, and people start adopting those clothes. So that's where we see diffusion, is the spreading of culture, and the cultural hearth is where it starts. Now, acculturation is when a society changes because it accepts innovation. For example, the United States uses acculturation all the time. In the United States, we did not invent things like certain types of foods. So we did not invent spaghetti, but what we did is that we accepted the innovation of spaghetti, and it changed throughout the entire United States. So that's acculturation. Society's having to change. It could be something very small. It can also be something big that might be forced upon a group of people. An example of this would be the Native Americans. They were forced to adopt certain types of cultures and become part of society when they were told to go off and go to reservations. Then they were told to go to schools, and they were told to speak a certain language and adopt certain religions. So all of that would be an acculturation, society accepting innovation. It's not always a good thing. It's not always something that they want to do, but that's the definition. Now, we also have an importance of language, and it's kind of interesting because our language, if we really look at it, is kind of interesting. It enables people within a culture to communicate with each other, but it does reflect all aspects of our culture. So, for example, there's a talk that the Inuit in northern Canada, you start getting up near the ice shelf, what we see is that this language, the Inuits, they say they have 30 different languages or 30 different words for snow. Now we might sit here and say, well, that's kind of silly. We only have one word, snow. But if you think in the English language, we have got things like sleet, we've got snow, we've got powder, we've got slush. All of these are technically snow, but they're different types of it. So that's a reflection of our culture. Of course, a country that is near the equator like Ecuador, they're probably not going to have that many words for snow because they don't need it, because they probably never have seen snow down there. So it's a reflection of our culture. We also see that language helps establish cultural identity. It can unify, but it can also divide people and cause conflict. There's certain words and certain things that we do not say, we should never say, and that's where that conflict can kind of be about. Now, we also have language families. A language family is basically, you are going to start with certain languages and they kind of spread throughout. For example, if we went to England right now, we know that we could go to England and we can converse and talk with people from England, but they're going to say some words that we have absolutely no idea what they are about. Why? Because when you start putting distance between people, the languages start to adapt and change. There's between 3,000 and 6,500 languages spoken worldwide. Similar languages belong to the same language family. We've got a good example here. What we're going to do is that we're going to watch a video later in the year over Brazil, and we're going to talk, and they're going to be talking Portuguese. In Brazil, they speak Portuguese. For people that can speak Spanish, they'll hear this, and they'll be able to follow along a little bit sometimes, kind of connect some words, but obviously they aren't going to be able to know Portuguese. The reason why is that Spanish and Portuguese are in the same language family, so there's going to be some similarities, but there's mostly going to be differences. There's also a dialect, and this is a version of a language like Southern drawl. For example, if you've ever heard somebody from Texas say y'all would be part of a dialect. They do say that in Nebraska we don't have as much of a dialect as other places. For example, if somebody came from Wyoming, if somebody came from Iowa, somebody came from Nebraska, you would probably really not know where they're from. If somebody came from Texas, or somebody came from Alabama, somebody came from Boston, you would probably know where they're from because of their dialect. We also have language diffusion. Language can spread via trade routes and migration. We're going to talk about things like the Silk Road. We're going to talk about different areas around the world that language can go ahead and it can spread. And what we find is that usually it has to do with money. So when these trade routes are happening and migration occurs for people looking for jobs, what we see is that language kind of connects everybody, and people start learning other people's language so that they can go ahead and they can trade with them. Also about cultures, we're going to see religion. What we do when we study religion is that we don't look at it from a really in-depth standpoint, but what we're going to do is we're going to look at them overall. In geography, that's very important because in the world, there are different religions in different areas. For example, in India, most of the people are going to be Hindu. If you look to the South and East Asia, you're going to see people that are going to be a little bit more Buddhist. If you start talking about Southwest Asia and Northeast Africa, a little bit more Muslim. In the United States and Europe, you're going to see people that are going to be a little bit more Christian. And then the last one is going to be Jewish, which are going to be kind of spread out throughout the United States, Europe, and Southwest Asia has got Israel, which is very important in the Jewish religion. So these religions are going to be very much centralized in certain areas, and that's why we have to study them, because of course there are wars that are fought over this, connection with people, so on and so forth. But for a definition, a religion is a belief in a supernatural power that made and maintains the universe. We need to know the difference between monotheistic and polytheistic. Monotheistic will be the belief in one God. Polytheistic is going to be the belief in many gods. Now, an animalistic or traditional faiths believe in the divine forces of nature. This would be things like Native Americans. Now, we see religion that can spread, and religion is going to spread with diffusion, but it's also going to be spread by conversion. Conversion is when some religions try to recruit people to become part of their religion. This happens throughout all different types of religions, and they're basically trying to spread their religion and have other people become that part of that religion. So what are the main religions? And what we do is we categorize 5 main religions. There's kind of little offsets of them. There's some different sects in them with everything. Different groups, I should say. And then what you'll also see is that there are some that don't quite fit into these major categories. But the oldest religion is going to be Judaism. This is monotheistic, again, belief in one God, evolved about 3,200 years ago, and their holy book is called the Torah. You also have Christianity, evolved from Judaism, which is based on the teachings of Jesus Christ. It is the largest religion with 2 billion followers worldwide. And then you have Islam. Islam is going to be the monotheistic, based on the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. These followers are going to be called Muslims. They're going to worship their God called Allah, and then their holy book is the Quran. Now, one thing that we got to make sure that we understand here in religion, and we got kind of a map that we're going to show. What happens is that Judaism is going to be established a long time ago. Okay? There, we're going to put for Judaism. So this is about 3,200 years ago, and their timeline just continues on here. Now what ends up happening is back in the long days ago, they're going to go ahead and they're going to have a split. People that continue to believe in the Jewish religion will be called, of course, Jewish people or Israelites, but you also have a group that breaks away, and this right here is actually going to be people that are going to be Muslim. And yeah, you heard that right. Muslim people and the Jewish people actually share some history. What happens with the split here is that there is a disagreement over essentially what happens. And what occurred here was that Abraham is going to be considered to be the father of the Jewish people, and he and his wife Sarah are believed that they were not able to have kids. And so what happens is that Abraham is going to go ahead and he is going to have a child outside of marriage. That child is going to be Ishmael. So that is his firstborn son. Now, the problem then is that later on, Abraham and Sarah have a son. And that son then is going to be Isaac. And now the question becomes, who should be the heir to Abraham? If you believe that Isaac was the heir, you would consider yourself to be Jewish. If you consider Ishmael to be the connection to Abraham, you would go ahead and you would be Muslim. Now, of course, if I could keep drawing this, we're going to go ahead and we're going to see a big split here, and then there's some disagreements about gods and prophets and things like that. So, but the original split actually comes because of that disagreement. Now, what we see is that we continue to see this language continuing on, and then in the year 0, there we go. It is believed that a person named Jesus Christ was born. Now, the question here with these two religions is we see a major split here. And it comes down to the argument of, was Jesus a person, a prophet, or was he the Son of God? If you believe he was just a prophet and not really the Son of God, you would consider yourself to be Jewish. If you considered him to be the Son of God, you would consider yourself to be Christian. Pardon my bad drawing, but you would consider yourself to be Christian right there. And so what we see is that this split right here in the year 0, that's where the argument comes about right there. So those 3 major religions are all connected. Now, why is this so important? What we're going to see is we're going to see some argument and fighting between the Jewish people and the Muslim people. And what happens then is that the Christians step in and say, we're going to side with the Jewish people because we feel that we have more in common with them. Now, there are also a couple other religions that we look at in terms of the main religions. Hinduism, this is a polytheistic religion and evolved in India around 5,000 years ago. The Hindu caste system has a fixed social caste, specific rights and duties. And what we see with the Hindu caste system is that they're going to go ahead and they're going to connect with the religion of Hinduism, and that's why basically a fixed social class system has been fought over for a long period of time, and that's why they had that. And we'll talk more about that later on. The final religion of the five main religions is Buddhism. This is actually an offshoot of Hinduism that evolves about 563 BC. So it's a relatively new religion in India. Siddhartha Gautama is going to be called the Buddha or the Enlightened One, and he's the founder. He's going to reject the Hindu caste system, and he's going to seek enlightened spiritual state, which we call nirvana. So the Buddhism, Hinduism, those are going to be the relatively new ones. You're going to see Judaism, Islam, and Christianity are going to be the older ones, but those are our five main religions. There are other Asian practices, Confucianism, Taoism, and Shinto. Those religions are going to be important, but the thing about them is that by numbers, they're not as big as the other five main religions, and they're also not spread throughout the entire world. Last but not least, we're going to talk about creative cultural expressions. And what we see is that all culture expression themselves are creativity. And what we're talking about there is something like a music, dance, theater, film. That's all going to be reflective over culture. I'll give you a good example of this. If you look at the old days in the 1980s, you're going to see a lot of movies that portrayed Russians as being the bad people, and really they were the Soviet Union and the Soviets. What happens is that during that time, that was kind of the Cold War, and everybody was really worried about them. So what we saw was that they were kind of the villains. That is a reflection of our culture. And what we see is that music, dance, theater, that is all going to be a reflection. Architecture, painting, sculptures, textiles, all of these are going to form visual arts that's going to show and reflect culture as well. You're also going to see oral and written languages like poems, folk tales, stories are all reflections. So we will actually go through and we will talk about some of these cultural creative expressions. And what we see is that we can kind of tell what it's like inside these areas. For example, if we're talking about Mongolia, they're going to go ahead and they're going to have some folk dances and things like that, a little bit more traditional lifestyle. You start looking at a place like Japan, maybe a little bit more westernized and modernized. This concludes our lecture over Chapter 4, Section 1. Please complete the assessments at this time.